Hi all. In the last video, we had a chance to discuss several different plant species, and obviously there are a lot of other examples that one could use, and there's some of them are in your textbook, but they just happen to be the ones that filtered to the top of my interest list these days. We'll have a chance to watch a little bit of a video about apples in these coming week, and so I think you'll find that one really interesting. Great little video. But I wanted to focus a little bit more on animal species. Certainly, human beings are animals, and animals, even though they were domesticated quite some time after plants, I thought we'd revisit that a little bit. And here, of course, is the little slide graphic that I've used before. Notably, when we talk about plants, remember plants were domesticated in the neighborhood of about 75,000 years ago. When we talk about animal species, we're really talking probably over the last 10 to 15,000 years. Certainly sheep, approximately 12 or 13,000 years ago. Cattle around the same time, really beginning with oxen and then later all part of the Bos genus, and then leading our way around some of the other organisms. Certainly the two that we know very well from our dinner plates, certainly the chicken in the Indus Valley, notably about 8,000 years ago, there was evidence that genetic manipulation, that is, selection of chickens, began about 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. So they had been domesticated just prior to that. And of course, in China, the pig itself was domesticated. The pig, you'll notice, looks like a little balloon animal there. And that's intentional because the pig, quite remarkably, was selected for a very, very important reason. First of all, it would eat things that human beings would not eat. They took waste piles, garbage that humans would throw out. They would consume it and turn it into an extremely valuable commodity. You're probably all thinking barbecue, but in fact, pigs were extremely important in the early phase of their domestication, again in that kind of 6 to 10,000 year range. None of these dates are absolutely precise because we didn't keep track those kind of records. We didn't keep track of those things in the early agrarian societies. But pigs were important because they got fat. They got fat, and fat was incredibly important in human culture. Why? Not to eat, but rather fat could be rendered, animal fat in particular, could be rendered into oil, which was used to light the lamps. So not only could the fat be rendered for oil to create lamp and create light, but also the residual of the rendering process is wax, and they could make candles. So pigs were really important for human society because they contributed to the production of light. You might get a sense at this point that maybe things were not domesticated the way we use them today. They were not originally domesticated, and certainly the bird was like that as well. The chicken in particular had a really important role in human societies. Chickens were magic. Chickens were magic. And as astounding as that seems today, why were chickens important? Remember, what was that bright object up in the sky that brought daylight? Light, very important for human beings. What was it? The glowing orb. It was Apollo on his chariot, bringing light to the world. And how did Apollo know when to come to the world? Well, the rooster crowed And when the rooster crowed, Apollo came, and oh my gosh, you got to protect those roosters. You got to take care of the roosters. Because if they don't crow, maybe Apollo wouldn't show up. And in fact, in Greek mythology, the herald of Apollo was a golden rooster called Elector, Alektor. And in fact, it was Elector's crow that announced Apollo's arrival to the world. So chickens were actually magic, and in part they played a very important role. That is very different than, of course, their McNugget-influenced roles today. So kind of cool, different way to look at it. We, of course, have the turkey, which was originally domesticated in North America, as I mentioned, especially in the United States area and part of Canada, which was brought back to Europe by the early explorers and heavily selected in Europe, and then, of course, for different color patterns. They became very, very popular in France, where the royalty of France would have flocks of these giant white turkeys running around, and that was part of their culture at the time, to look at these beautiful, regal white birds in the gardens of the royal families of France. And what we haven't kind of talked about at this point is the oldest of the domesticated species, in the order, again, about 50,000 years ago, and of course, our buddy, the dog. And notice here we have an example of the original gray wolf, and what, of course, we've done to these poor animals. Okay, so when we think about our buddy the dog, we know in the early days of canine domestication, the original ancestor, as I mentioned before, was probably a hybrid between a red and a gray wolf that eventually helped humans. They came in very, very close contact with human beings. Now, notably, most of us kind of have this image of our canine buddies helping humans hunt. That seems to be a recurring myth. And there's no doubt that at some point the early dog, played some kind of role in that regard. Certainly very important in terms of herding sheep and herding other animals. So really playing a variety of roles. But there is also some archaeological evidence that suggests that the female dog were actually the first of the wet nurses for human beings. And that is one of the characteristics of domesticated animal species, is that they readily accept the young of other species. Readily accept the young of other species. So it's not entirely out of bounds to consider that after humans gave birth, women certainly had to go back into the field to help with the hunting and the gathering in human societies. But what do you do with this little baby that can't contribute at this point in time, can't work? Leave it with the dog, who just had a litter of puppies. And there is certainly archaeological evidence that exists to support this idea. And you can go back to Zunner's book on the domestication of animals and take a look at some of the archaeological evidence as well. So really interesting concept. Don't know if it's right. Nobody was there. But an interesting idea to think about. And certainly there is a lot of human myth about humans being raised by wolves. So we see this quite a bit. Certainly, there is also archaeological evidence of humans using leashes to tether their dogs during hunting. And again, we think about this. These cave paintings came from Saudi Arabia about 8,000 years ago. So we really have the concept of the dog indeed helped humans hunt. And notably, when we think about the behaviors of domesticated species, perhaps one of the most important characteristics is that the animals had a very short flight distance from humans. That is, they didn't run away very far or quickly, and in fact would tend to approach humans. And there was a wonderful experiment that came out of the animal genetics lab in Russia by a scientist, Belyev. There is a great section of your book that highlights his work. I was very disappointed. Another one of those people that I wish I had met as I was going through grad school, and unfortunately, I missed his talk by about a year. He actually spent some time with my major professor, and but I did not join the lab until about a year later, so I was really disappointed. But later in my career, I had an opportunity to meet with one of Belyev's students, Trut, and Trut did quite a bit of work on hormonal changes that occurred in silver foxes, also in domestic sheep, that occurred during selection for approach to human beings. So they set up an experiment where they would choose animals to breed for the next generation simply on whether or not they would approach human beings or if they ran away. And it turns out that nearly all of the hormonal changes that we associate with domestication, for example, a reduction in seasonal breeding patterns, all occurred as a result of selection for approach to humans. So really some interesting ideas about how simple selection can alter complex physiological changes in organisms, especially, of course, vertebrate. I kind of love this picture. This actually came out of an early edition of our textbook. And if you take a peek at our little pedigree of the different canine species, we see up at the very top our ancestral dog, again related to a wolf species. And we see that there are 4 major families of dogs. There are the herding breeds down the left-hand column here, and you could see we have all of the shepherding breeds, German Shepherds, Collies, Border Collies, and in fact the Corgi with those cute little legs, and a lot of pictures floating around the internet about the Corgis. We'll come back to this in just a moment. There are some of the hunting breeds. These are the Spaniels. We see them quite a bit, the Spaniels. The Poodle is associated with these breeds, the Setters. Also, another set of the working breeds. We see the different hounds, the retrievers. These tended to work as well with hunting. I always find it fascinating to me that the Great Dane, of course, and the Dachshund are actually from a related family of dogs. So if you talk about extremes that can occur due to humans taking control of the breeding system of any organism. And finally, we have the very large working dogs, the Mastiffs, Boxers, Newfoundlands, the Labs, common dog found in today's world, and of course the Bulldog, and later on a little bit of a Bull Terrier. A good time to mention that the pit bulls that people talk about these days have nothing at all to do with bullfighting rings. There was a Facebook meme that talked about pit bulls having been evolved to hold onto a bull's jaw in the bullfighting rings of Spain, and nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, the traditional pit bull today has been tracked back to breeds between the terrier and the bulldog species, and it is true that they have been some of the lines or families within pit bulls have been selected for fighting, and dogfighting, a terrible aspect of our lack of concern for our animal species. However, uh, thankfully, that's something that seems to be receding into the past. Not gone entirely, but receding into the past. I also wanted to know, we talked about some single genes in the different plant species, and notice the one that I'd like to really point out is the corgi, very short legs, and the dachshund in two completely different lineages of dog breeding. And in fact, both the corgi and the dachshund have the very, very short legs that is associated with a mutation in FGF3, which is a really important growth factor, fibroblast growth factor 3. It is a very important growth factor for cartilage development and therefore bone growth. Really a fascinating phenomenon where a similar mutation occurred in the same gene to create a phenotype of interest for humans. Interestingly, it is a mutation in that identical gene that is responsible for achondroplasia in human beings. And so if you think about achondroplasia in humans, the so-called little people, if you watch some of those reality TV shows, are actually due to a mutation in the FGF3 gene. Turns out that the FGF3 cascade is also responsible for dwarfism in cattle, also responsible for dwarfism in ducks. So really kind of an interesting perspective. Not, by the way, chickens. That's actually a mutation in the growth hormone receptor gene. So really interesting phenotypic comparisons among and between the different vertebrates. When we think about our changes in animals and organisms, it's interesting to compare how many animals there actually are in the world. Some recent work by the Wildlife Federation suggests that over the last 20 years, we've had about a 60 to 70% reduction in the populations of wild animal species. However, our domestic species continue to increase in population. If we look at the population in 1990 to 1992, there were about 1.3 billion cattle. By 2014, there's about 1.4. Today, there's about 1.5. Sheep and goats, about not quite 2 billion in the world. Pigs, rolling around 1 billion in the world. Cattle, notably, are declining in population, or rather, horses are declining in population. Buffalo and camels declining in population. Of course, our buddy, the chicken, has been increasing to about 22 billion chickens in the world in 2014. And of course, in 2019, we're approaching 25 billion chickens in the world. So really a large increase in the population. Why? Because it's a huge source of protein, both in terms of eggs and chicken meat for humans. Humans, of course, went from 5.3 billion people in the world in 1990 to 92. In 2014, 7.2 billion people in the world. And of course, this was 8 a.m. on this past Friday. There were approximately 7.8 billion people in the world and 330 plus million in the United States alone. So really, we see these changes in both plant and animal populations in direct response to an increase in human population growth and our need for the resources, primarily food, that are provided by both plants and animals. A recent survey that was published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, this shows the relative amount of biomass on the planet. And in fact, you can see in part A of the figure, you could see that of plants clearly provide the bulk of the biomass on the planet, about 450 gigatons. Bacteria, tremendously numerous, 70 gigatons of bacteria. And animals way down here, about 2 gigatons. Now, if we break down what exactly is the distribution of animals, you can see that arthropods are the predominant source of biomass for animals. Fish, next up, about 0.7 gigatons. And notice down here, when we think about our livestock and human beings, there are approximately the same amount of biomass between livestock that we keep, that is domesticated vertebrate animals, and notice that wild mammals are only a very, very small, in fact, about 10% of the total biomass of human beings alone. So this kind of matches up with the Wildlife Federation's estimate that numbers of wild animals are actually decreasing worldwide. Probing these data a little bit further, we can see very clearly that the bulk of the biomass is actually terrestrial. When we look at different environments and different tropisms, we see that the plants, of course, are mostly terrestrial. Fungi are mostly terrestrial. When we think about kingdom Animalia, of course, we see the bulk of the biomass is actually in the water. These are marine animals. So we see that there's a fairly substantial percentage, about 70 plus percent, 70 to 80% of all animal species are actually in a marine environment. So we see that these distributions of biomass are really relevant to changes in human population, okay? As humans increase in number, we have tremendous influence on our environment, on the number of species that exist, as well as the relative mass of the species, and of course, everything that goes along with the energy consumption of those species as well. So it's a really great time to talk a little bit about population growth. We've already mentioned that human beings are rolling right now a little bit over in the mid 7 billions. Notice that we are on track, okay? We are on track to hit 8 billion people in 2024. Some of you, this will be just prior to graduation or right around graduation. And really a little bit crazy to think about 2024. Our expectation is, when we look at population growth, our expectation is by 2050, we're going to hit 9.3 billion people on the planet. I can tell you with great confidence that there will be 9 billion people in the world by 2040. 9 billion people in the world by 2040, and more than likely slightly before then. I can tell you that that's a fact. Now, you may ask, how is that possible? And I'd like to think for a minute, as biologists, why I can say that in 2040, approximately 19 years, why do I know population will be 9 billion in that time frame? As you begin to think about it, the answer is really rather obvious. Excuse me a sec. Sorry about that. The house phone was ringing. It never rings. The reason that it's obvious, and hopefully that gave you a moment to consider, is because all of the parents of everyone who will be here in 2040 are already alive. They've already been born. So we can really predict, even in the face of pandemic, that all of the parents of all of these people are still alive. Of course, population growth itself, we can see, does in fact depend upon how many children human beings have, that is, how many children parents produce. And we could see what happens if we produce at a current constant rate. Now notice all of these models, at a constant rate with an average number of children by 2.5, 2.0, or 1.6. Obviously 2.0 is just replacement level. If a man and a woman, a couple, have 2 children, that just replaces them in the population. 2.5 grows the population. Our current population rate, we would see there's this exponential curve. Notice, please, that all of these population figures are very, very close to one another when we look at the 2040 mark. Why is that? It's because, as I said the last slide, all these people are still alive. Obviously, if we continue the way we're going at 2100, if we have over 25 billion people in the world, it's going to make things pretty crowded around here. The goal, of course, is to try to get into this 2.5, 2 to 2.5 area. Notice, of course, that if we get to 1.6, the population begins to decline, and if that's because by the mid 2000s, 2050 to 2075, what begins to happen here is death rates begin to accumulate. And of course, we're not replacing people, so the total population actually declines. So we can see that we have this tremendous increase in population that's heading our way. Why? How could we possibly reduce these fertility rates? And of course, I think the best way to do this is to understand why the fertility rates are so high to begin with. Notably, if we look around the world and we say and we ask women, how many children are ideal? How many children do you need? What's the best family size? If we go to Niger, they say the best family size is 9 kids per family. Uganda, 5. Jordan and Egypt, considered to be the more developed countries in the Mideast and North Africa, they say about 3. In the UK, 2.4. We get to Austria, Germany, even in the United States, the average is about 1.5 to 1.6. So we definitely see that there's tremendous geographic differences in what the expectation is for the best type of family. Of course, we need to look at the reasons for this. And I think the 2 biggest reasons are displayed in the graphs below. This is from a 2007 study from the Population Research Bureau at the United Nations. And if we look at the total fertility rate and the percentage of girls that go to secondary school, that is equivalent to junior high and high school in the United States. And you can see that the smaller the number of girls that actually have more education, the larger the family size that they think is, this is not thinks ideal, sorry, this is the number of children that they actually have. If we look at countries where 90% or more, 90% or more of the girls are enrolled in secondary school, thereby getting more education, notice the fertility rate drops to about 1.5 or 1.6. Obviously, we also can plot the relationship between fertility and poverty. If we look at the percentage of population living on less than $2 American per day, yes, $2 American per day, the greater the percentage of the population that is living on less than $2 per day, the more children they are having. The smaller percentage rather, or proportion of the population living on less than $2 per day, the fewer children they are having. So we see a clear path to changing the trend of population growth in the world by increasing education and reducing poverty. So this is really where our efforts need to be to control population growth. Really important aspect. So what does all of the population mean? What does this growing population mean? And I first began creating this slide again when I got back from working at the University of Cairo. This was in the late 90s, and had an opportunity to visit developing countries in North Africa. I began to realize the importance of population growth and how genetics can help us to resolve some of the problems that we're going to see along the way. Of course, the easiest problem is indicated by population growth and also poverty and education is the degree of undernutrition in the world, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But who knew that when I talked about disease transmission, we were talking about increasing animal and plant populations. Of course, this means that given a fixed land mass, plants and animals are going to be closer together. So the ability to transmit disease among and between them becomes more and more common. Certainly when we think about the avian influenza epidemic occurring not to humans, but of course among and between birds, when we think about the porcine pig influenza and some of the other diseases of our domesticated species being very close to one another, we see a lot of transmission of diseases. Of course, this also is happening among and between humans as well. So we're beginning to see, as a result of human population growth, we live closer and closer to one another. And by virtue of that proximity, it is easier and easier to transmit diseases among and between one another. All right, and we're seeing the results of that these days in the speed at which the pandemic is propagating throughout the population. We also have an issue of shrinking gene pools. That is, our genetic variation among and between domesticated species is declining. We see that with a reduction of wild species, but we also see it in our domesticated species as well. The apple video that I mentioned a little bit earlier will really emphasize this to you. Of course, the final part of this is xenobiotic transmission, worrying about diseases crossing from an unrelated species to human beings. Of course, our early fears were that avian influenza would jump from waterfowl and or domestic poultry into human beings, which never really happened, but I don't think anywhere in our prognostications did we ever think that a virus from a bat in rural China would end up taking and over the world and running rampant in human populations the way that it is now. And we'll talk a little bit later on in this semester about how genetics is helping us to understand and combat that problem as well. I think when it comes to the human side, we have tremendous social friction. We are experiencing more cultures than ever before. And of course, while I think that this is a very positive element, we can certainly learn from one another and recognize how not just that our differences exist, but rather look at the commonalities among and between all of us. Unfortunately, being exposed to a lot of different cultures also creates an opportunity for tension, whether it's linguistics, that is, we don't always speak the same language, we don't use words in the same way, whether they are cultural differences, whether it's the foods we eat, the cultural norms or mores that we all participate in are different, and so we find that this is an opportunity rather than for learning and understanding, but can also cause friction among and between us. And so I think this is something we've got to work as a community to really think about carefully and to try to ease the tensions and take the opportunity to learn from one another. Human biology also has some interesting elements to this. Even though our population is increasing, are we seeing a decline in genetic variation? And we'll have a bit of an opportunity to discuss this when we talk about personal genomics and human genome sequencing toward the end of the semester. And a recurring thought is there any natural selection occurring in human beings anymore? It used to be people who were susceptible to a disease or had a genetic propensity towards a particular disease, they would just not reproduce, and we would see a reduction in the incidence of those diseases. Is that true anymore? Human medicine intervenes these days and makes it possible for people with different genetic diseases or deleterious mutations. It makes it possible for them to leave children. In fact, we'll see an interesting case of this in one of our pedigrees in a bit when we look at how human medicine has enabled a particular family that has a mutation on the Y chromosome that prevents men in the family from making viable sperm, and changes in our reproductive biology knowledge and techniques have made it possible for these men to actually continue to reproduce. And in fact, we have about 4 generations right now that have been reported in this family where otherwise that mutation would never have existed. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. It's kind of a fun way to look at it. Of course, I promised you a little bit about undernutrition, and I think that the good way to look at this is, I'm sorry if this is a little blurry, but for some reason you're not seeing the clarity that I would prefer, but I think you could at least identify the colors at this point. This is put out by a division of the United Nations that used to be by the World Population Bureau. And what you can see here is an indication of the number of people who are hungry. So what do we mean by hungry? We mean that these people are undernourished, and undernourishment is defined as those people who are subsisting on less than 2,200 calories per day. 2,200 calories per day. And you can see the blue are actually, it says on this slide, less than 2%, but in a more realistic perspective, what we really see is that these countries don't always report to the United Nations the degree of individuals that are undernourished in their populations. However, we see in the yellow situations where 5 to 15% of the people are undernourished, that is, do not get 2,200 calories per day. In the orange, up to 25% of the population do not get 2,200 calories per day. And of course, the worst is in the deep red, where you've got 35% of the population at that time are undernourished. That is, they are not getting 2,200 calories per day. A lot of this is happening on the continent of Africa, although the Americas are not immune to this problem. We see, especially in Mexico and the northern portion of South America, we see a substantial fraction of people are undernourished. Now, before we go thinking that this is a problem only in other countries, I would like to point out that when we look at the USDA data on food security, thanks to a change in the federal government, they don't talk about, we no longer discuss hunger or undernutrition in the United States. We talk about food security. And food security is defined basically in the same context as undernutrition, is, are people going hungry? Do they eat 3 meals a day? Do they have enough to eat? Does their budget last throughout the week, or do they run out of money and run out of food? And if we think about it, 90% of households in the United States are in fact food secure. However, frighteningly, 10.5% in 2019, 10.5% of households are food insecure. What's even more disturbing is if we think about those households that are food insecure and we separate out households with regard to whether or not those households have children or do not have children, it turns out that if we look at food insecurity, 15% of households that have children under 18, these are your peers, 15% are food insecure. So a really striking and, in my opinion, embarrassing figure in the United States. When we think about where these things occur in the United States, we can take a look at the prevalence of food insecurity, and perhaps unsurprising to some of you, the dark orange are where we have food insecurity above the U.S. average. So above that 10% line, we see predominantly southern households. The curious thing to me is Ohio, Kentucky, and West Virginia are also experiencing food insecurity well above the U.S. average. Our buddy little New Jersey in here nicely is, we're doing fairly well, at least in the context that we are below the U.S. average. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't worry about it. Okay, do not interpret that as something to worry about. Any percentage of households, especially households with children that are experiencing food insecurity, needs to be addressed, in my opinion. I thought, we throw these terms around, 2,200 calories. We always wonder, I think it's hard sometimes for people to say, well, what is 2,200 calories? If we were in class, we would have a chat about it. I'm sure some of you are tracking your nutritional intakes with your cell phones. Some of you are probably looking to experience a certain kind of a diet. So you might be tracking protein if you're an athlete. You might be tracking fat consumption. You might be tracking carbohydrate consumption. If you have diabetes running in your family or just hypo or hyperglycemia. But I think it's always a little bit of an education to think about where do you get your calories. And so I always like to take a peek at our good friend Ronald McDonald. And what's really unique to me is that if you look at a Big Mac, fries, Coke, and an apple pie, we approach 2,000 calories. And in fact, if you throw in a couple of cups of ketchup, those little thimblefuls of ketchup for your fries, you get awfully close to 2,000 total calories. Now, I do have to tell you, I know that some of you have probably gotten those 2-for-1 coupons in Sunday's paper and have probably actually spent an evening at one of these restaurants and actually eaten 2 Big Macs, fries, Coke, and an apple pie. You might have even gotten a Diet Coke. But ultimately, that would have been it. So on those days, I suspect that you still went home and had dinner or breakfast or lunch, depending on when you ate this. So when we think about total calories that we eat, we talk about this 2,000 or 2,200 calorie requirement for human beings. Not surprising. Imagine people who that's all they ate in a day, as opposed to what we consume in the West. I do think for our purposes, and when we think about increasing percentages of obesity, certainly in the civilized world and in America in particular, I always look at this distribution of carbohydrates, fat, and protein. I always look at this in the case of protein consumption. In this 2,000 or so calorie meal, you only get 35 grams of protein. Among friends, the rule of thumb is 3 ounces or 85 grams of protein per 150-pound body weight, or about 70 kilograms. And notice that even though we are very close to achieving our caloric requirement with this meal, we are less than half of the total amount of protein for human beings. So if you think about how many calories at McDonald's you would have to eat to get 85 grams of protein, it means that you would probably need to eat 2.5 times. You'd have to eat this meal 2.5 times to get the proper amount of protein for your diet. So, interesting way to look at it. So imagine instead of 1,800 calories, you were eating 4,300 to 4,500 calories a day just to meet your protein requirement. No wonder obesity is increasing in the United States. So we see that calories are cheap, protein is expensive. So as a great stopping point, I hope you can begin to see where I think elements of genetics, and we're going to, as we approach all of our different topics in the coming weeks, we're really going to focus on how we can attack some of these issues, some of these problems using genetic solutions. And I think this is really an exciting part of the upcoming decade with all the different tools that are available. If you understand basic genetics and then take some of the modern tools that we're able to take advantage of, I think there are a lot of these problems that we have the potential to solve. So, you guys take care. Don't forget that this week we are going to start our Friday synchronous Zoom meetings. You'll be getting an invitation to those about midweek. So take care, stay safe, and see you shortly.